Kathy Lawless, Life Story Curator, bringing you this podcast series, How Did I Get Here? A series of interviews designed for people just starting out in their careers, in transition, or possibly feeling stuck, and giving them access to stories from people who have been there, done that might inspire them in a new way to take action. Today I'm very excited to be introducing Tripp Gebhard, and I met Tripp through Strategic Connections. So welcome, Tripp.
Thank you.
And Tripp is a multi-generational wealth planner, and he works with families on more than just financial planning. He works on the personal side of wealth, I guess the values side of families and wealth. But we'll get into that a little bit later, because I always like to start with the icebreaker questions.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Tripp, because I know a bit about your story, the icebreaker questions for you might take us down a little bit different path than some of my other interviews, but we really need to kind of get into this first bit. So talk to us about where you grew up, how many siblings, and where you were in the birth order, and kind of how all that influenced who you are as a person.
Sure. So I was number 2 of 4. My older sister Jean was 14. I was 12. My brother Luke was 7 when my youngest sister Kitty was born.
Oh, wow.
So we had kind of a wide range of ages and a lot of parenting going on with my parents for all those years.
Yeah.
I was the first son, obviously. I was the first grandson. So when you ask me that kind of question, I would say that I was the dominant figure in my family.
Mm-hmm.
And as we discussed, my grandfather on my mother's side of the family and my grandmother on my father's side of the family were really the kind of I think parental figures for the entire family, for all of us.
Oh, okay.
So
more so than even your parents.
Well, yes. I mean, at this stage and looking back, because of kind of how the structure was set up, it didn't really allow for that much because money. Really, on both sides of the family, there's different stories around that, but yeah, it just, they were really the dominant figures in my life. Now, of course, my grandfather, who died when I was 12, was just a huge hit for me. And that really set me back. I mean, I would say even from a trauma standpoint, losing him was losing a very big part of my life.
Yeah, because you just referenced he was almost like more of a parent than
exactly.
a
And I was the
grandparent.
first grandson of 3 there was 3 granddaughters, my 2 cousins ahead of me. And, the family lore is kind of like, my grandfather just, he raised 3 nephews. He had 2 sons. He was, World War II U-boat captain. And I think just, the kind of squeaky little girls ganged up on him and laughed and stuff. And I was there to, kind of his buddy, so to speak. So, he took a very, very strong role in my entire life up to that, before he passed.
Yeah. Great relationship. So where were you? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, more specifically Ladue, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis. One of the more wealthy suburbs in the country. St. Louis, there's a few facts about St. Louis that are, I guess relatively, St. Louis has a lot of negative press these days, but, going back to 1904, we had the Olympics. It was the 3rd biggest city in America.
See, didn't know that.
Well, the Olympics, the World's Fair in 1904, so there was,
that was combined.
Well, if you look at the way I look at it today is if you look at Denver, LA, San Francisco, and really everything west of the Mississippi, it went through St. Louis. So that was the kind of the western expansion from the eastern seaboard, did the stop in St. Louis, the gateway to the west, western expansion. So everything really with the confluence of the Missouri River and the Mississippi River, it just was the major hub.
Wow, okay.
So I experienced, obviously, in growing up, St. Louis is one of the older, wealthier towns. It's just very, the haves, the have-nots at this point, because it's not an aggressively growing city like Denver. So there's a lot of differences that I've seen, within multi-generational wealth and how that affects families going after certain after the generations come down. Where Denver, for instance, didn't have any money in the 80s and has since, boomed with, land development. Technology's huge here, so there's just this massive growth. And it's interesting because a lot of my clients and different people in my influence and circles have opened my eyes to the fact that, the same problems I think that wealth has created in a lot of families back in St. Louis is kind of, and when I say issues, I mean it's money getting in front of interpersonal relationships and structures and, social statuses and stuff. And Denver's all kind of new to it, but if you look at the wealth that's been created, there's just an awful lot of damage that's been done with people that don't really understand the impacts of wealth. And that's really what we try to do with our clients, and create a value system and a tenet that they can come back to. Because for us, what I've seen in my career over 25 years is it's never about the money, but it's always about the money, right?
Yeah.
And so what's underneath that you're fighting about the money, you're setting up systems within your family that might be unhealthy around money, but they don't know they're doing it.
Yeah. So you grew up with multi-generational wealth. It sounds like your family comes from having a lot of wealth, and you were part of that. So you third generation of that, fourth generation?
So in both of my families, and on my mom's side of the family, there was as I mentioned, my grandfather. He came from a coal miner's family. He was, as I mentioned, he was a U-boat captain in the South Pacific for 3 years. He came back. He raised his 3 nephews in Southern Illinois, with faith, family, service to country, service to community, and built up 5 gas stations, was very successful, moved to St. Louis. He bought an oil refinery, grew that, and then he realized that, the commerce, the moving, the transporting the petrol and eventually wheat up the Mississippi River was a lot. They were making more money than he was refining the oil.
Ooh.
And so he got into the business of actually the towboat business and built one of the largest towboat businesses in the Midwest.
Wow. So very much a self-made.
Very much self-made. It's interesting because, his life when he came to St. Louis, he never had a drink before he was 33 years old. He was raised Baptist. And when he came to St. Louis, he really, to fit in, and, he told my mom, people in the big city drink, and he got really caught up in the power, the prestige of wealth, social statuses. I mean, the guy was on every board in town, president of every board in town. Like he really, really, even my mother, who would never say a single thing bad about her father, said he did have a chip on his shoulder of being a small town country guy, and he was just going to make it all the way.
Ah, so self-made, but wanted everybody to know, I'm here and I've made it.
Yeah, and I think it just, it's when you lose your kind of base values of who you are and what you're made of. I mean, my grandfather raised 3 nephews who were, one was CEO of a couple publicly traded companies. One was a director in the FBI, long career. And then another uncle of ours nephew of his had a dental practice for 50 years in St. Louis, and, raised kids with great value systems. And not that everybody, is perfect in life, but, they got that kind of side of my grandfather, which is what I ended up getting. The sad thing in the story is that he did not have the abilities to give that same love, care to his own sons. Because I think his mind was, I'm doing all this work, it's my job to bring these kids up and pull them up, give them the best education, tell them they're the greatest. And they came in, took over the business, and there was conflicts and power struggles for years, and ultimately my grandfather's alcoholism progressed to the point where they were able to kind of take over the company. And I was very involved with that because my mom was the peacekeeper in the family. So my grandfather would come over, he'd be there when I got home from school, he'd be crying about what his boys were doing to him. And then, dinner, and then maybe one of the uncles would be over and, bad mouthing my grandfather, doesn't know what he's doing. And so watching my mom kind of go through that, it was a valuable lesson, and it was also, very difficult. Ultimately, my grandfather died, and within 2 years, the company went bankrupt. So that's kind of when a lot of the real kind of dysfunction started happening within the family.
Yeah.
Divorces, just the destruction that we saw, and then here
well,
were
that's a big stressful event.
Very
leading
much
up,
so.
And it's not just it happens one day. I mean, there's all the leading up to it and all the frustrations and what do you mean we don't have enough, and what do you mean there's not to finally make the decision to go into bankruptcy has got to be such a tough one anyway. The stress and pressure of that is many months, years before that, right?
Exactly. And I think the way that I look at that, and my grandfather did everything that he thought he needed to do to make my uncles successful. But what they were lacking was the talks at the dining room table. What are their value systems? My grandfather had shifted his value systems to fit, what he thought was most important.
So they only knew the new grandfather in St. Louis and the new way your grandfather was, not necessarily how he grew up and all of his values and what was there before that made him and the company successful.
Exactly. And what I've seen so much with this issue in particular is that this pattern repeats itself every third generation. I mean, and it's and there's a lot of statistics, and when I give my talks, I actually bring out some statistics, but just to quickly go over that, 93% of the wealth that's created will not be there for your children, your grandchildren. 87% of the time it won't last, for your kids. So that whole short sleeves to short sleeves, laborer to wealth to your grandson's back to being a laborer, it's very, very true. And the there is family money that can last generations upon generations, but there, in order to do that, it takes a lot of work to set up value systems. I mean, I have a good my sponsor in St. Louis, how Rick has raised his family and implemented the value systems, and let them fail in some small businesses, but be there with them so they're learning their lessons. It's very orchestrated and organized.
Yeah.
And money is the money is not going to stand in the way of, and the wealth is not going to stand in the way of that interpersonal relationship. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the key, is people when they start making that money and they start having successes, it starts building up who they are, and it feels good. But with that power, kind of becomes a breakdown in, the family value systems and the interpersonal relationships within the family.
Yeah.
It's just very common. There's more things to do, which is a great tool with money, is, doing fun things, but, it can separate people. It can put them under their own little paths that and just break down that family value system.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, but I've had people tell me they knew going into it that it was going to do this, and they didn't know how to stop it.
They didn't know how to stop. It was just a train, so to speak.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and I knew when we got into this part of it, this is such an important part of who you are today, because you grew up with this, and you knew no different, right?
Correct.
You're in it. So now so let's take you back to, your junior high, that 12-year-old.
Sure.
How did that influence you as a person then? I mean, did you know then, someday I'm going to be a wealth manager and I'm going to make this better for my family? Or you probably lived a life of just in the same shoes until a certain point, right?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, it was, I can look back on it, I just didn't have a value system. So I did, and my parents, of course, raised me with great values. I mean, but my mom was alcoholic, and my dad was kind of an avoider of things. So,
and your grandfather, you said, was an alcoholic.
Yeah, my grandfather was an alcoholic, and so, I think I was always, it was more like I just really didn't know how to turn the wheels. I didn't know how I was going to fit in the world. I didn't know what my value system was. I didn't trust that my friends, my close friends who I grew up with in high school, and I kind of tell some of my story, they're like, Tripp, you were the guy who was like taking care of everybody. We go to the Dead shows and, somebody has a bad trip. You were the guy who was, taking care of them, helping them out, making sure we got to the next place on time. So I didn't view myself as that, though. I viewed myself as being completely lost, and they viewed me as being a leader.
You were the leader. You were the responsible one.
Yeah, but to me, I just felt like I was irresponsible because I didn't know what responsible was.
Okay.
I just didn't have a context to say, oh, I'm a good person or I have good values. But I was also raised in an alcoholic home. I was allowed to drink at a very young age. And that was just, it's kind of my destiny. I mean, that was my destiny. And then I had to kind of, break the chain. So ultimately I did end up getting sober at 33 years old. But that time between there, sure, I'm experiencing life. I had 2 kids, which is the main reason I got sober. I didn't think in my own life that I was maybe worthy of even being sober, but I could do that for my 2 boys.
So something bigger than you.
Something bigger than me. Finally got in the way of living that life that I just didn't have any other option. I didn't know. So when because I was at a very early age, when you're raised in an alcoholic home, those are the tendencies you take on, and when alcohol is the kind of the number one factor of everything you did, it just, again, I just had no choice. I was destined to be an alcoholic.
Well, and what about your siblings?
Well, it's interesting. I was the first one to get sober. My youngest sister, Kitty, we're very close, she ended up getting into Al-Anon, which is the support group for Alcoholics Anonymous. And so we actually share the same sobriety date. She was 21, I was 33. My older sister, Jean, is sober as well, and she's doing amazing. And my brother, who doesn't have a problem with alcohol, he's done enough therapy to get him into the same space that we are all in and supportive of each other. So it's been great to see. And, I'm really careful to, when I talk about, my family being alcoholic, there was so much love. We just didn't really know how to contain it or call it, and there was a lot of hiding. In alcoholic families, it's you're kind of left to kind of think about, where are they? Where's their emotions? Because, somebody's going to react differently, whether they're hungover, whether they're drunk, whether they're just frustrated, all those type of things, right?
Yeah.
And so as a kid, you learn to read other people, and I think that's probably one of my biggest strengths as a financial advisor, and what I do today is kind of understanding how people, how they make decision-making processes and help them try to think logically versus illogically.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in a very illogical mind and had to work myself through that.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I wanted to have you tell your story is that, well, like most of my interviews, I think that people learn from other people's stories. And when we look at people from the outside, we think it may have happened a certain way. And so when I think of you, oh, he's a wealth manager, well, maybe he's been in this business his whole life, but there's other reasons that caused you to be in this business. So talk a little bit about how you got into the business and why. And I think it has a lot to do with how you grew up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I'm being completely honest here, I got in this business. I had a buddy of mine, and we were out partying, not doing great things. And backing up a little bit, I myself had a trust fund, and I got it at a very young age. I believe I took control over it around 22 or so, but I was, 21 was when I was able to get my access to money, and it was a serious amount of money. I'm somewhat embarrassed to say when I tell people it was somewhere between $350 and $450, and so that sort of allowed me to just, when I graduated from University of Denver, it allowed me to kind of live the next, I guess it would be 6 years, I was living in Denver, and so I'd work half the time, wouldn't work half the time because I didn't really need a job. So if there was any type of tension or anything with a boss, I'd be like, you know what, I don't need this crap. Mm-hmm. And then I might be unemployed or half employed for 6 months, and when I started feeling really crappy enough about myself and that I'm not in this world and what do I do, I'm completely lost. I'd go find a job. So I'm with a friend of mine, and I said, he said, hey, we got this job at Invesco, and I'm working there, and you should come. We're looking for more people. And my question was, do they drug test? Of course. And he said no. And so I went in there, got the job on Tuesday, and started maybe the next Monday. And so that's really how I initially got in this business, which is absolutely insane. I actually was in the business for a couple of years. Then I went to work for a cousin of mine who was in the recruiting and consulting business. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up leaving the financial services business, working for the company in Denver. I took a promotion outside of Colorado. I went to the East Coast. My wife and I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, which we loved, and we were there for a couple of years, and ultimately we landed back in St. Louis, where I grew up. I started a consulting company or division within this company in the IT space, and I guess it was 9/11 happened, and there was no need for recruiters anymore. Mm-hmm.
The economy.
Yeah, and I had been
really hit the pause button for a minute.
Yeah, and I'd been making really good money. For a 20-something-year-old, I made more money than I thought I ever would, and then that all kind of came crashing down, and I was left with, okay, what do you do now? And since I had experience in the financial services business, that felt like the easiest thing or the quickest fix, and that's when I got in the business. Is 2002.
Okay. And then, so this is your second chance or second part into the business.
Correct.
So were you sober at this point?
No, actually, my first year in the business was my last year drinking, and I was like a boy wonder. I mean, I had relationships, I had connections, I was out every night at happy hours all over Clayton, Missouri, which is kind of the business district now in St. Louis. And I again had a lot of connections and a lot of access to opportunities,
and it felt like this is easy, right?
Yeah, it kind of
go
felt
out
like,
and have drinks with people.
Exactly, this is easy. This is and slowly I think the unstructure and all that just opened up more opportunities for my alcoholism to creep in, and so I was in the business for a year, and I also realized, I just had this intuitive kind of sense that if I'm ever going to be successful as a financial advisor, I got to get sober. Mm. I just knew that intuitively. And then there was the alcohol is a progressive disease, so I was getting more and more sick and tired of being sick and tired. And ultimately, as I said earlier, it was really more than anybody, it was my two sons that just, I was able to do it for them. I couldn't do it for myself.
Well, I'm glad you did it.
Thank you.
Because that's who you are today now.
Yeah.
And so then I know you mentioned your sponsor was a very strong influence in your life. So, and in most of my interviews, there is, there's some sort of role model, coach, but in this case, it's all those things and sponsor, right? Or maybe there's more than one.
There is. There's more than one. There's a ton of people, and that was the biggest change in my life. I didn't see it right away, but up to that point, I either had mentors that I couldn't relate to, or mentors that were, quite frankly, not bad people, but had not the best lifestyles.
So they were the same path you were on,
yeah,
right?
Well, and even worse, and particularly what I'm talking about would be my two uncles, and kind of when they lost the company and watching their lives deteriorate. So that was, they were my mentors going up. Again, being the first nephew, they were big football fans, so we would go to the St. Louis Cardinals, which used to be in St. Louis, now the Phoenix Cardinals, or Arizona Cardinals. And so I'd go down to games with them it felt like a lot, at least a few times a season. And I really thought these guys, and they thought they were really cool too. I mean, it was, they kind of had an aura about them being raised that way, and I just thought they kind of owned the world. But they were very, very, how they were raised, again, not having that nurturing. It was more the male ego being built at a very young age, and being raised by nannies, not having, the family unit and the structure there to support that. Mm-hmm. So fast forward when Rick has been my sponsor since the beginning, and there was a family kind of connection, but I never really knew him. But there was enough of a connection that, and he was a leader in the meeting, and so I ended up asking him, to be my sponsor, and he said, "Look, I'm not going to be your grandfather. I'm not going to be your father. I'm not going to be your brother. I'm not going to be your cousin. I'm not going to be your friend. I'm going to be your sponsor."
It's a different
deal. It's a different deal. And he said, with that, you have to agree to my rules. And if we are successful in our relationship, I'll become all those things to you, and you me. And so it was just, and then he gave me real structured, I look at that back and I laugh today when I talk to people, because one of the agreements was, he said to me, if I agree to be your sponsor, you have to agree to these rules. And it was 90 meetings in 90 days. It was all these, but the one thing that got me more than anything was, he said, in 3 weeks, I'm gonna evaluate where you are and determine whether or not you need to go to rehab. And I get to make that call. And he said, and we're going to do that every 2 weeks after the 3-week period. I don't know why he gave these numbers. We've had this discussion.
He had a knowing about it, probably.
Well, he did some, and some he sort of can't remember even saying. But that's the funny part of it is he felt he needed to create this structure. And here's this, if I just didn't go to AA, I probably would never, run into him again, right? And but here's not a stranger, but close to a stranger. And I look back on that, and I was so desperate for structure, and I was so desperate for change that I was scared to death that I was going to disappoint him. And so I was just willing to do, and I had never taken direction. I would say
this sounds just like this is the first time in your life you've felt that way.
Oh, the very first time that I ever felt that way. And being kind of, I was the dominant figure in my house for sure. That includes my parents. I was the dominant figure. I believe in even the greater context of some of the big family stuff. That's how I kind of always was. And I didn't know really how to take direction, because I had to figure it out myself as a kid, and I wasn't getting the same answer or the right answers, or I knew the answer was wrong, or I was told, don't go there. Why are you always bringing up this stuff? When I'd ask questions. So you just have to figure it out yourself. We were forced to.
Yeah. Wow. So everyone thinks you got it figured out, and you're like, I don't have it figured out at all.
Definitely did not.
Your friends thought that way, but it sounds like your family also was looking for you to be that way.
Probably. You mentioned that, and I guess different people within my family that had recovery, and they would always say, I never in a million years would have guessed you were that way. But, alcohol is it's a lonely business. It's something that you take inward, and in relationships, that's kind of I think what it separates you. It wants you to be separate. It wants you to hide within yourself. And so, you can have, that's, I guess, the great thing about, like, how do you break that? Is it, to me, it's God inspiring. It's something that happens outside of your control. Like, all of a sudden, Rick says this, and here I am willing to listen to him because I was just desperate enough at that moment.
Yeah. So very much a life-changing, pivotal moment for you, meeting him. And
extremely pivotal moment. I've sponsored so many great men.
So now you're on the other side.
I'm on the other side. So, and that's, and so then I also get to, I have, not only my St. Louis community, but a big part of my growth here in Colorado is actually gaining, another sponsor here and what all that entailed, and then building out my community here and, having those mentors support me. We're both in Colorado Thought Leaders Forum and Strategic Connections. And the mentors and the heartfelt leadership of the men, that was so huge for me because I got into personal coaching. I mean, I've had a lot of different coaching opportunities with some great men and women here in Colorado, and then the mentors in CTLF that I've met, Colorado Thought Leaders Forum, who really kind of bridged like the final kind of stretch of any brokenness from where I was and my alcoholism, and kind of blended like this is who you are. And to be that to have that authenticity, to be able to really serve your clients and serve your community, is you need to have that authenticity. And that's, to me, kind of what these different people that have come into my life, you being included in one of them, that share themselves in an open and honest way that allows me to be free with a lot of the stuff we're talking about, Kathy. I had immense shame attached with it all, and so getting rid of that shame and some of the circumstances and the trauma that we experienced, I believe is now my greatest strength.
Yeah.
There's casts in the different casts of characters, like, you wish they had lived their life differently, or that they had humbled themselves in such a way that they could have had different lives. But for me, it's just a valuable lesson, and it's part of my makeup. And so, again, seeing this and the patterns that repeat themselves with wealth, it's astonishing. I mean, I've been early in my career, you learn from big mistakes, but I've had people tell me, like, I know this is gonna, like, all this money that we're given X is gonna be blown and gone, and I'm like, as the financial advisor, you're kind of like, well, this is the father saying this about the son. They're both clients, and then you watch the mess happen, and
you can't just sit and watch it.
No, and now, obviously, when you experience those things, those things don't happen much later in your career because you learn such great lessons from them. And I think that's what makes us different, is that we really do, our tagline's personal side of wealth, and to me, that means that, we want to understand what's underneath the family. Where is your value system? What do you want, your value system to be? And we actually create that in our plans as a kind of a tenet or a constitution that, here's kind of who we are, here's where our makeup, here's where we came from, here's what we want to see, here's our value systems. Because we know the money's not going to be there, right? We know either the creator's going to lose it, the kid's going to lose it, or the grandson's going to lose it 93% of the time. So if we know...
Yikes, that's a big hog.
If we know the money's not going to be there, statistically, this is MIT, Harvard, 100-plus year studies, we know it's not going to be there during good times and bad times of the economy because of how the breakdown within the family system gets infiltrated with money. Now, money's not a bad thing, and it's an amazing thing for tools, like to do wonderful things for other people, for your family, to create experiences. And I'm all about elevating, and I'm all about growing and providing, but I want to do it with my clients in such a way that there's structure there so that they don't lose focus on who they are and allow their kids to become something that they don't want them to be. And it's not done on, it's not the fault of the tablet, it's not the fault of peers, it's the fault of the parents. And so they have to be the ones who want to change their own. They have to want to be open and, about their own stuff. And so there's a lot of times there's work to do within them. And I think a lot of like our process when you go through the values, building the structures, I think that's just the beginning, but that's part of their kind of family constitution that they can grow with. And the conversations, we're meeting with our clients, let's say 3 times a year, 2 times a year, depending upon, sometimes it's more. And so you're having these conversations as you go along, and it life doesn't become this mystery that you're better prepared for it because it's something that you're focused on and you can relate messages, and we help with those messagings down to children and just step in front of what is the inevitable slow train.
Yeah.
It's like,
well, it's interesting, that there's always these studies about if you knew something was going to happen, or it's just an awareness of what's going on in the world. And so if you're aware, if the families hear that statistic, that's got to at least cause them to pause and think, well, wait a minute, is that going to happen to me? And why would it, or why wouldn't it, or what are we doing? So it feels like it opens the door, that you're at least bringing, there's an awareness to it, and how do you plan for that? And
yeah, and again, I think having the, I've kind of done the work myself, and I've done, a lot of work in understanding my own family, on both sides, and so I have my own thread, but I also have my clients' threads. 25-year relationships with seeing how people, decisions that they make and the things that they do. And then just being in the community that I was in, it's very affluent, and you have people that have not worked sometimes for generations, and what does that breed and how does that look? There's just a lot that comes there. It gets down to their perception of the world, their self-worth, and I see that just kind of get stunted when they're not involved, when they're only concerned with what they're doing and the good time that they can create in the next week. It just becomes flat after a while.
Yeah. Well, and very short term, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Even though...
But, here's the deal. Like, I look at a lot of those people, my father being one of them, and he had my dad worked, he celebrated 50 years at a hospital, Lexington Brothers Hospital in St. Louis, as a pharmacist. But his whole story is, hey, the money was kind of from the family patriarch. Psychologically, I think it was incredibly tough on my father to have the patriarch of the family, which was actually his, I guess, great uncle, but was technically my grandfather, his father's, he raised him. Mm-hmm. And so, but he was very involved. I'm the namesake, my dad's the namesake. And, it was just everybody, Carl was a tyrant. He was German. He was, he believed in kind of beating you into manhood. And I don't think there was physical abuse, but there's a story that was told that, my dad was 12 years old. And Carl had given a gift to one of his foremen at his foundry. Mm-hmm. And he did that in order to set up the stage for my father. He then asked my father, do you want a camera? And my dad said, I'd love a camera. 12 years old, was all excited.
Got to be new for the times, too.
Yeah, so he sat him down, explained the story, and said, you need to call X and tell him you want the camera back that Carl gave you. And the reason he did that was he wanted to teach him how to be tough, how to be able to, so that kind of, that was damaging to my father. So my father's had this money his whole life. He was told that, you aren't good enough, you're not tough enough, we're not going to give you the business, which is the greatest thing that ever happened, my dad says now. We're not going to give you the business, we're going to sell it, and then we're going to put it in trust, and you don't have to work because you're worthless. And now I will applaud my father because he did spend 50 years at a Lexington Brothers Hospital. That was his community. He went, but he didn't take promotions. He didn't try to better himself. And so, we've had some really serious heart-to-heart conversations in the last year where, my father has flat out told me that, honestly, Tripp, if I could do it over again, I would not have that money because I would have had to go forge a life of my own. I would have had to, make tough decisions. And he said that money was like it kept me in the corner. It was like a wet blanket. So, that's his perception.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like it allowed me to escape life. And I think that showed up in how he was in our family and how he was in other areas that left us guessing somewhat.
Which then, again, this is your role model. another one of your role models as you look at yourself growing up. Well, it's interesting as I think about, you and I have had, we've met several times and talked different times about your story, my story, etc. I've not come from multi-generational wealth. So, when you're a kind of a self-made person, this is just so foreign to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking it might be foreign to many of my listeners because I've been really focusing on listeners who are, starting out their career, in transition, or stuck. But I guess I assumed maybe these listeners wouldn't have a trust fund or any kind of safety net. And that's why maybe a lot of times there is that panic when you're in transition or stuck. You're feeling like I don't have anything that's next. So I'm trying to figure out how all this is going to relate to listeners. How do you think it relates to listeners? I mean, you come from such a different upbringing.
Yeah.
But yet it's really family values are what are so important is what I'm hearing from you now. And
I think, there's, I think it appeals to, when you asked me to do this, and I think one of the things that appealed to me is, there are a lot of kids that are in this situation and we're seeing and that are raised in this system that I'm talking about. And they don't really have the self-worth to get going, to find themselves. They weren't raised with that kind of structure. Now, there's everything in between, right? But I think what I would want to aspire to would be, there's to families, like there is hope, to children who are teens, who want to, or can't get out of their mess, can't get out of what they are. They don't feel worthy. They say they want to be happy, but what's happiness? Happiness is helping other people. Happiness is serving. But when you come from an environment where there's entitlement, it's very, very hard to break down those barriers and just be a normal person. Mm-hmm. And, I've kind of changed my tone over the years, but it's like you hear this and it's like, people want to knock wealthy people just like they want to knock some other group of people, right? So if somebody comes from money, what do they say? The first thing they say is like, oh, well, he came from money, he didn't make it himself, right? And so part of that, that aura that people hold over themselves kind of keeps them from actually, breaking away from the mold, so to speak, or breaking out and trying to try to do something. And a lot of times it comes down to they know they have money, and they just don't want to change that. They're not willing to go the extra length to get the job, to keep the job, to raise, because they don't have the drive, so to speak. And I think that's a common problem that it's not just wealth. It's kind of what's going on right now with changing of technology, and there's just a lot of disconnect. There's a lot of people with kids that aren't really well adjusted to actually have a successful launch. And so we're seeing that a lot more and more. And again, it's like you don't have to be super wealthy. You don't have to be, addicted to drugs or alcohol. Sometimes it's just, the current model hasn't allowed for us to catch up to, the disconnect of cell phones and the addiction to cell phones that is prevalent within parents as it is in children. So, again, if everybody's staring at a screen, where's the value system? Mm-hmm. And it really does get back to, do you want to do this in a way that is going to be sustainable, that you can come back to over and over again? I'm doing this right now with my own family. So we're creating a value system within our family unit that my siblings and I are taking on and to help us get to the next phase of our lives and with our own families. And I see it's really cool because now it's kind of spreading out to my cousins who, and so the stories are closing and we're starting to see each other and hear each other and share our experiences in that trauma.
Yeah, and in an authentic way, I'm guessing.
In an authentic way to make sense and to, families without a value system or without a defined value system, they tend to take on all these identities. I had my identities, my sister had her identities, etc., right? Mm-hmm. And those were defense mechanisms perhaps that we created at that time, but the clothes no longer fit, they're out of style, and we need to grow. We need to acknowledge each other, and some of that for some of us has taken longer, and it's been a harder process, and it's but I think ultimately it's just I told my siblings, I said, we have to applaud the love and the care that we did receive, and
because when you think about what your dad received, that it didn't feel like love. There might have been good intentions there, but yeah.
There was good intentions there, but it kind of caused damages, I think. And then, but for us to be able to, have 4 children and cousins that are thriving, who all kind of grew up in the dysfunction that we experienced, says a lot about the character of the people in our family. Mm-hmm. But again, alcohol and drugs get in the way of a lot of that. So that's kind of where the problem, I think.
You kind of have to break through that first, if it's there.
Yes, if it's there.
Yeah. So, since you deal with multi-generational families, it sounds like you work with maybe the grandparents, the parents, and the children. What advice do you give to the children, I guess? I mean, are they a lot of times I'm guessing they're at the age where they're starting to manage their own money, or they're starting to be career age, college age, that type of thing. I mean, are you coaching them on how good it feels to be a contributor, and that what it takes to be earning, even though you don't need the money? What could that mean for you?
We certainly have our own process to uncover that, and I think a lot of what happens, and we're talking about doing entire weekends with families, like just one family, or maybe doing multitudes of families so that they can kind of share ideas. But I would say that there's an education process that we implement. There's messaging that we like to carry down to the kids, and ultimately it's giving our clients the strength and knowledge and care to be able to send the messages down. So that's a lot of its empowerment to the parents, I think, and the grandparents. And
I guess that is a tough message to say, that we know you're not going to have this wealth. The money's not going to be there, or I don't know. That's got to be a tough message. It's like either I don't, are you sending the message I don't trust you, or is it more? It's just a matter of fact thing. The money may not be there. Most likely won't be there.
Well, so if we're in a family unit, we have our financial and our fiduciary responsibility to help them find their, what does this financial picture look like, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is, if you go to a really good financial planner, I think that's what you're going to find, is that they're really good at what's the taxation of this? How does it get down to this generation? And the first 20 years I was in the business, it didn't matter who I was talking to, an attorney, a CPA, other financial advisors, other CFPs. I mean, it was just like, you got to get the most money down to the family as possible. My clients,
that was the goal.
That was the goal. Mm-hmm. And my clients would tell me, I want to give as much money as I can. And I actually I was having lunch with one of my clients, and he said, Tripp, we're out of nowhere. Now, he's been retired for 2 years, real estate and everything, and he was thinking about going back in. And I said, I never talked about it. I was dying to get out of the business. So, of course, my question was, why would you do that? Why would you put you and Ann's, retirement, and your kids are going to get so much money? He goes, well, he said, I want to leave my kids a boatload of money. I asked him why, and he said, I don't know. That's a great question. So, I thought about that for a while, and as I'm driving home, that was what initially I asked my father, what did that money mean to you? And he gave me his story. Mm-hmm. But with this client, I realized, and we've since talked about it, and he's not going back in business, but what we talked about was, look, your grandfather and his siblings did not speak because of problems over money. Your father and his sister don't speak because of money. You haven't talked to one of your sisters in 15 years and the other sister in 12 years, okay? this is just a pattern. And so he wanted to leave a boatload of money to his children so that they wouldn't hate each other. They'd have enough. Like, that doesn't fit in any value system.
Or if you look at any data points either. If you look at the data points, the data says...
You're setting them up for, a disadvantage.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, what's boatload of money really mean, right?
Exactly.
So you're chasing something. It's like, you used the example earlier about, well, I just want to be happy. Well, if you don't define what makes you happy, then you're chasing this, I just want. It's a wanting of something, but you don't even know what that is.
So I kind of term that, when to kind of get back to your question on how do we work with, I think a lot of it is the value systems. A lot of it is engineering, like, success in the estate plan that leads to successful behaviors, whether it be some type of a matching program to get the money you have to earn, they get the equivalent, or maybe you get a multiple of what you earn. But just, if you're thinking to leave a boatload of money, I can tell you your value systems need to be worked on or checked, and looked at. Like, we need to understand why. And that's what we came up with it. And so that's no longer his mission. That's no longer his, because, there's no value in just getting the most amount of money to your kids. That being said, again, we want our clients to elevate. We want our clients to create, healthy value systems in their family, so that when they do pass the money along, their children, and hopefully that bleeds into grandchildren. There's a stronger, there's a constitution in place.
Yeah.
And it may not be perfect, but it's going to continue the value discussion going downhill.
Yeah.
The current estate plan, normal estate plan, doesn't have anything about that. It's all financial.
Yeah. So had he said to you, when you asked the question, why do you want to get back in the business, he had said something like, I miss it. Or there's parts of it, I miss the camaraderie, I miss the work and the deals, if there'd have been anything else maybe, but no, I want to leave a boatload of...
And I knew he didn't want to work at all.
Yeah, okay.
I knew he didn't want to work at all. But yeah, you're right. Look, it's...
Or I want to teach my son. My son wants to get into the business, so I was going to teach him, or I'm going to teach my daughter, or I'm doing this for... If there'd have been a different reason then.
Yeah.
But he was kind of on autopilot, because that's just the way he worked.
Exactly. And I think, knowing him, he really, truly doesn't want to work. I think, but there may have been some, instability, because when you do retire, I actually I strongly suggest, we have discussions about retirement for many, many years, but, I've brought in, which is similar to what I do in other facets, when I see one of my clients struggling or one of their children struggling in an area, I may bring, or I may suggest they see a therapist or a coach to get out of kind of what they're doing.
Well, it's a big life change.
Yeah,
you need help with that.
Especially if you have the money and you can afford a coach or some type of a program, I really think that retirement is essential, because I see a lot of men kind of lose themselves when they do give up their kind of...
It's their identity.
Their identity,
yeah. That's their identity. Well, I went through it myself when I left corporate, and then I did some consulting, and then when I started my own business. Well, it's so different to be a solopreneur versus in corporate. I was, my schedule wasn't really my own. I'm leading teams, I'm leading projects, etc., on a big scale, and now I'm in a very different scale, and I've had a lot of psyche that I've had to go through myself in terms of, well, what was the hamster wheel? Why was I addicted to that hamster wheel? And am I doing enough? Is it enough? Is it enough? Am I making enough? All of those things, I get it.
Yeah,
the psyche is mindset is so important. So, Tripp, we could probably talk all afternoon about various experiences and stories in your life. When you do look back on your career, what are some of the characteristics that have served you that so someone else in their career might be thinking about, okay, well, maybe they're in transition or stuck, or maybe they're struggling with an addiction. What might be something that you would say to them?
Well, in answering that question, I think I'll go back to an experience I had with one of my clients' sons, who's I was at Blue Bonnet, South Broadway, which is my old stomping grounds at DU.
Back when you were at DU.
Yeah. And, here I am sitting with, a 20-year-old. Here, that was me, right? And in talking to him about what he wished his life looked like, because he wants to be happy, but he doesn't know how to be happy, right? And he said, if I could just go back and my family would be normal again without Dad bringing in all that money to the family. Dad was an international business traveler, so he didn't have the family unit and the father figure in his life, and ultimately his older brother died of a heroin overdose, and he ended up and the father ended up leaving the family, and so he attributes all the wealth to the breakdown and the dysfunction that his family's never recovered from. And they are getting help, and there's a great story there. But in talking to him, I realized I kind of put myself in his shoes, and it's kind of a spiritual moment where I'm sitting across the table from this guy, and I was him. I was truly him. And when he talked about wanting to be happy, it kind of came to me and I realized that, I've never raised my level of consciousness. I've never grown without the help of a mentor, another person, even like yourself and what in our Colorado Thought Leaders Forum, my sponsors that I've had, and so
everybody kind of brings some
new
experience, new thought.
I'm a sum of my mentors, and with that, creates my value system, creates my structure, and then. By learning service to other people, by learning, what's truly going to make me happy, I am able to, go out there and serve people in an authentic way, and that just wouldn't be possible without their mentorship and support. And quite frankly, I feel safe and loved in that environment, and I want them to, in turn, be proud of me. So it's kind of creating that that system and that structure of love and support. But really, it's truly the mentorship is I just would never have been where I am without being around good people and taking their advice and asking for help. And I think that's the biggest thing that I see with the kids today is their ability to ask for help and to let a mentor into their lives, but it's absolutely essential. It's been absolutely essential for me. Yeah.
Boy, you bring up a good point about asking for help. It's not easy, and sometimes it makes you think like you might appear weak or you don't know what you're doing, and you're trying to prove that you know what you're doing. Asking for help is a difficult thing, and it's something I think over time and age is just, you get to the point where you have to surround yourself by good people, whether that's your team, your leaders, just positive role models. So on that note, Tripp, I want to thank you for being so open and honest and sharing your story.
Well, thank you, Kathy.
I know this is not a story that is talked about many times openly in conversations, and usually it takes a bit of getting into knowing someone before you would hear this type of a story. So thank you for sharing that and with the listeners, because you never know who you're going to move, touch, and inspire today, and who needed to hear this story today. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Listeners, if you enjoyed today's interview, please subscribe, and you'll be alerted for other interviews as they come forward. If you have any questions for me or for Tripp, please post that on my website, lifestorycurator.com, and we'll make sure to get that information over to Tripp. And on that note, you have a great day. Thank you.